This story was originally shared by a young adult using the name Alex on yourghoststories.com in 2018. It took place in the remote Bighorn Mountains near Buffalo, Wyoming, and was posted under the non-human entities category. The writer emphasized that the experience was real and told without exaggeration, choosing not to share their real name because of how disturbing the events were. In September 2016, Alex headed into the mountains like he often did, making these trips 4 or 5 times a week without ever expecting anything unusual. He always packed light but smart, bringing 2 bottles of water, a few Nutri-Grain bars, and a loaded handgun, mostly as a precaution against mountain lions or bad weather, which were the only things he ever really considered dangerous out there. That day, instead of going to the area he was most familiar with, he decided to explore a more remote site known as Hettinger, which sat about 15 miles from the town and wasn't a spot people usually went to. There was a fence he crossed that led up to a peak with a view that stretched far across the snow-covered mountains. The isolation didn't bother him, and he had always thought of the area as peaceful, untouched, and empty. While scanning the snowy ridge below, he noticed a tall, thin figure moving steadily across the landscape. At first, he assumed it was a hunter, but something about it didn't add up. Hettinger wasn't close to any designated hunting zones, and there were no vehicles or signs of other people around. Still, Alex lifted his binoculars to get a better look, figuring it was probably nothing important. But when the lenses focused, he dropped to the ground behind a rock without thinking. The figure was staring back at him. There was no reason for that to be possible though. He was hidden by both rocks and trees at least 1,000 feet away, yet it had clearly seen him. Something about the way it looked toward him felt too direct, like it knew exactly where he was. He peeked up again slowly, barely lifting the top of his head over the edge of the rock. The figure hadn't moved. It was just standing still and sniffing the air, still facing his direction. That was the moment that his chest tightened. He felt frozen, like he couldn't even shift his weight. Behind him, maybe 200 feet away, he remembered there was a rock formation with a small cave carved into it, barely wide enough to crawl inside, but deep enough that it might give him some cover. Staying as low as possible, he began to move backward toward the hole. Right before he reached it, he looked over his shoulder and saw the figure had started sprinting. Not walking, not even running, but full speed. It was coming for him. He dove into the narrow rock opening, pulling his backpack in with him, and pressed his body against the cold ground inside. He could hear the thing outside before he saw it. When it stepped into view, it was only feet away from where he had just been. In the dim light, he could make out its skin, which looked damp and pale gray, and its fingers, which were unusually long and ended in sharp points. The air in the crevice felt thinner, and he had to cup his hand over his mouth to keep his breathing quiet. But even that became difficult because of how cold the air was. At some point, as he adjusted his hand, a small rock shifted and rolled down. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw attention. When he looked up again, its face was already turned toward him. It was staring directly into the narrow opening of the rocks, with its eyes catching the faint light. He wasn't sure if it could see him or if it only sensed something was there, but it still moved closer. It stretched one of its long arms through the gap, close enough that it nearly touched his backpack. For a moment, he didn't move, nor did he breathe. He just watched it from inches away, and it stayed like that for several minutes, shifting slightly, sniffing at the opening, pausing and reaching again. Eventually, it gave up and stepped back. By the time night had fully arrived, the figure had wandered off. He waited as long as he could, listening carefully before peeking out of the hole. There was nothing though, no sounds, no figure, not even tracks in the snow. The ground looked untouched, which didn't make sense since it should have left some sign of its movement, especially at that size. Regardless though, Alex started the long walk back down toward where he had parked. He kept his steps slow and deliberate, avoiding any unnecessary noise. When he finally got to his car, he used the physical key instead of the remote lock to avoid the sound of beeping. He slid into the driver's seat, trying to calm down and get his bearings. Just before starting the engine, he looked out one more time. That's when he saw it again. This time, it was standing near the tree line, tall enough to match the height of the surrounding trees, and it hadn't moved since he'd seen it. It was just staring. He then turned the key and hit the gas. The tires slid a bit as the car fishtailed on the icy path, but he managed to straighten it out. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that it was following, somehow keeping pace even as he sped toward the highway. The road twisted and dropped as he made his way down the mountain, and eventually when he looked back again, it was gone. He hasn't returned to that area since. Afterward, he looked into local folklore and descriptions of creatures tied to northern and mountain regions. Everything he saw reminded him of what he had encountered. The description, the size, the behavior, even the smell in the air seemed to line up with the old stories people used to tell about something called a wendigo. This happened in the fall of 2006 in rural Ohio and was shared by a user named Into the Airwaves, who remembered it as one of the few times their childhood safe place felt completely unfamiliar. Behind their house was a dense stretch of woods that they were allowed to explore freely. It wasn't just where they played, but it was where they went to be alone, to climb trees, or to listen to the sounds around them and to feel like they had a place of their own. There was one tree in particular they always returned to. It had a sturdy branch about halfway up, and from there they could usually see part of the house through the trees. That tree had become their spot. Most afternoons followed the same pattern. They'd wander the woods, climb the tree, stay until the light started to fade, then head home when their mother called from the edge of the yard. She never stepped into the forest herself, not even once. That particular day was no different at the start. After spending some time up in the tree, they began to climb down. Just before their feet touched the ground, they heard their mother's voice calling their name. At first, it seemed completely normal. She always called when it was time to come in. But the thing that was off was, this time, the sound wasn't coming from the yard. It was coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere behind them. For a second, they thought maybe she had decided to come see what they saw out there every day. Then the realization hit. There was no way she could have passed them without being seen. The trails were narrow and quiet, and they would have noticed. But the voice kept calling their name, and while it sounded like her, something about the tone was off. It wasn't calm, but it sounded upset, even angry. They simply stayed still though, unsure what to do. The voice didn't stop there, but they still couldn't see anyone in the fading light. Then, from the direction of the yard, a second voice called their name, this one sounding exactly how it always did, patient and steady. Almost immediately, the voice from the woods repeated it again, louder this time, with a harshness that sent a chill down their back. These weren't echoes. The voices were distinct and coming from different places. That's when they knew something was wrong. The one in the woods sounded like their mother, but there was something underneath it that didn't feel right. Without thinking, they began to run. They didn't stop to look back or try to understand it, but simply pushed forward through brush and branches, focused only on getting out of the trees. The voice behind them kept calling though, sounding more frantic with each step, but still they didn't turn around. When they finally broke into the yard, their real mother was standing exactly where she always waited. The second they stepped onto the grass, the other voice went silent, not fading away, but gone completely. They must have looked terrified because their mother immediately asked what was wrong, but they couldn't answer right away. Not until they were back inside the house, door locked, did they ask if she had ever stepped into the woods. She looked confused and told them no, she hadn't gone anywhere. When asked if she had heard anyone else calling, she said she hadn't heard a thing. They proceeded to tell her everything as clearly as they could, trying to make sense of it out loud. She seemed unconcerned though, said it must have been their imagination, that they'd simply been out too long. But the voice they heard had matched her perfectly and they knew it wasn't her. Over time, they tried to explain it away, considering every possibility, but nothing quite fit. There was no one nearby who would have known their name, and no way their mother could have faked it. Years later, even after they moved away, the memory still stayed sharp. Whatever had called to them from those woods sounded exactly like their mother, but it wasn't. But yeah, they never stepped foot in those woods again until they were 17, and even then, they never stayed long. This story was shared by a Reddit user named Hales1721, who described an experience that took place in early October in a forested part of northern Minnesota, near or possibly within reservation land. At the time, she had been staying with close friends, referred to here as M and C, and had gone down around midnight to sleep in a camper set up for guests near the lake behind their house. She brought her miniature dachshund, Ebony, with her, planning to spend the night there. After setting up the heater and getting settled, it was around 1:30 in the morning. The camper door wasn't locked, but she hadn't thought it was necessary, being surrounded by woods and isolated from any nearby roads or people. At first, it was hard to sleep. Her anxiety was already high, and the noise outside wasn't helping. M and C's dogs were barking non-stop, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who normally burrows under the covers right away, wouldn't settle. Instead, she stayed perched on her owner's hip, shifting her head back and forth like she was tracking something outside the camper. No matter how many times she was tucked under the blanket, she kept returning to the same position. This went on for close to 40 minutes with no clear cause, until everything changed. She suddenly heard what sounded like M's voice outside the camper, calling out, "Anybody in there? Followed by the unmistakable sound of claws dragging slowly along the camper's exterior. At first, her instinct was to respond, but something stopped her. She realized that both M and C would have been asleep by now, and more importantly, M already knew she was in the camper. There would have been no reason for her to ask if someone was inside. As she lay frozen in bed, she noticed the sudden absence of sound outside. The dogs and geese had gone completely silent, and even the wind had stopped. It wasn't just quiet, but it was the kind of silence people describe when something unnatural is nearby. The kind that feels heavy. That's when she realized Ebony still hadn't barked, which made no sense. Under normal circumstances, Ebony would have lost it at the first sign of someone coming near. Instead, she sat there stiff, trembling, and completely silent. The idea of getting up to lock the door started to take hold, but she also realized the door had been unlocked the entire time, and whatever was out there might already be closed. She couldn't tell how long she lay there debating what to do, but she guessed maybe 10 or 15 minutes had passed. At one point, she considered whether it could be a skinwalker, but then remembered that skinwalkers aren't known for mimicking loved ones' voices to lure people out. Wendigo are. She recalled that making eye contact with one of them is what draws people outside, and that thought made her avoid looking at the windows completely. She walked slowly to the front of the camper, then, avoiding every curtain, turned the lock as quietly as possible and crawled back into bed without glancing outside once. Ebony finally settled under the blanket and for the first time stopped shaking. When she checked her phone, it was around 2:30 a.m. Moments later, the wind picked up again. The silence lifted and MNC's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper, then darted a short way into the woods. The geese began honking again. After a few minutes, the dogs returned and lay down outside the camper, as if to guard the door. She didn't get out of bed again until morning. The next day, she told MNC what had happened. A part of her hoped M would say she had come down to check on her, but instead, M confirmed that they had both gone to bed right after she left the house. That night, she prayed over the camper, the house, and everyone staying there, and nothing unusual happened. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Later, she spoke with someone who claimed to be knowledgeable about the supernatural and asked him about the encounter. According to him, a wendigo can suppress animals' reactions to keep them from alerting their owners. He also claimed that while a wendigo can unlock doors, it won't come into tents, campers, or shelters unless they're built from natural wood taken directly from the forest. He said they mainly stay in the woods, occasionally entering small towns, but never cities. He warned her never to step outside to relieve herself during the night while camping and to always keep curtains and tent flaps shut. After leaving MNC's and staying with her father, who lived 3 hours away, she began to feel that same presence again, especially when taking Ebony outside at night. She told herself it was just lingering fear and the weight of the experience staying with her, especially since she didn't hear or see anything, and Ebony didn't show the same fear. Still, the feeling never fully left. She planned to move back into the same area and was growing more anxious, unsure whether wendigos stay in a fixed range or travel with those they've targeted. She explained that prayers had helped her the second night and she had holy water she planned to use, but much of the information she found online seemed useless or vague. She wanted to know whether she was overreacting or if the threat could still be active. More than anything, she was looking for real answers, asking whether anyone knew if wendigos stay in one location or if they follow people across distances. This story, which was shared by a rural animal control officer, describes a call that led them into one of the most isolated corners of their county, an area made up of quiet, suspicious communities that don't take well to outsiders. The officer had worked in this region long enough to encounter more than a few strange situations, but this particular event started with a series of complaints from a woman who had recently moved into the area with her husband. Both were doctors who had come to serve the local population, and while their presence was appreciated, they quickly found themselves out of place. One of the ongoing issues they faced was the number of aggressive animals roaming freely, mostly dogs, though whenever the officer responded, the dogs were always gone by the time they arrived. The last call from this woman came with a different tone. She was frightened and uncertain. During a house visit deep at the end of a remote dirt road, she'd heard something growling behind one of the walls. When she asked the family about it, they rushed her out of the house. She thought maybe it was a mountain lion, although the officer knew mountain lions hadn't been spotted in the area for years. Still, he agreed to check it out. The house was located in one of the most unreachable areas of the county. He left early the next morning, filled up on coffee and gas, and began the long drive out. The road leading in was so badly maintained that he had to crawl along at barely 2 miles per hour, feeling every jolt and rattle through the truck as he climbed toward the end of the path. When he finally parked, the silence around him felt unnatural. The forest stretched in every direction, and despite the warm weather, a shiver ran down his back. Years on the job had taught him not to ignore his instincts, and for a moment he considered turning around. But he didn't. He ended up finding a faint trail leading into the woods, set a GPS marker at his truck, and began the half-mile walk toward the house. As he walked, he noticed something was off. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds of life at all, just the sound of his own footsteps. Eventually, the quiet broke as he got closer, replaced by the distant sound of children laughing and animals calling out. He felt relieved, but the relief ended when he stepped into a clearing and saw that the noise had come from nowhere. The paddocks were empty. The barn itself was sagging and near collapse. The house itself looked completely abandoned. Windows broken, porch rotting, front door barely hanging by a hinge. It didn't match the description the woman had given, and he called out to see if anyone was there, but to no answer. As he approached the paddock, he found a dead cow on the ground with 3 massive claw marks running down its side. The cow's eyes bulged and its tongue stuck out like it had been strangled before being ripped open. He turned away and made for the house, and he called out again, stepped onto the porch, and paused at the sound of a child crying from somewhere inside. He moved slowly into the house with his flashlight drawn, stepping into a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. Dust covered everything, dishes sat uneaten on the table, and the place reeked of mold and rot, but nothing really looked looted or disturbed. He passed through the kitchen, avoiding a hole in the floor, then checked 2 children's bedrooms, and finally reached the main bedroom at the back of the house. On the wall behind the bed were claw marks smeared in dried blood. He swept his flashlight across the room and saw a large shadow crouched in the corner. As the light hit it, he realized it wasn't a trick of the dark. There was actually something sitting there, taller than a man even while hunched down, with long limbs and thick muscle across its shoulder and arms. It had 3 claws on each hand, and when it made a low sound, it came out like a child's cry. Its mouth opened in a panting motion, revealing rows of large teeth, and the stench that came from it was foul. The longer he looked, the more convinced he became that it had been waiting for him. He backed toward the door, and the thing mirrored his steps, following him silently like it was sizing him up. When he raised his gun, it charged. He fired twice, and the creature fell back, roaring in pain. Without checking to see where he'd hit it, he turned and ran. He made it out the front door as the creature thrashed behind him. Its cries had changed to something almost human, like a child wailing, but he didn't turn back. He made it to the trees and kept moving, and at one point he ducked into cover and waited, clutching his gun and listening, expecting it to follow. But nothing ever came. Eventually, he stepped back onto the trail, still checking over his shoulder every few seconds. Now the woods were full of sound. Every crack and rustle made him flinch. When he reached the truck, he found 3 deep claw marks carved down the side of the driver's door. He scrambled inside, got the engine running, and saw movement just beyond the trees. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, watching him. As he began to drive away, he saw one last thing in the rearview mirror. It was the figure of an old man standing where the creature had been, 2 bullet holes in his chest. He nearly crashed at the sight but didn't stop. When he got home, he immediately tried to call the doctor who had sent him there. An elderly woman picked up, confused, and told him she'd had that number for over 20 years and didn't know anyone by that name. He called others in the department too, but no one knew what he was talking about. Whoever he'd spoken to that day hadn't been a doctor. He started to think maybe the calls had been a setup. As the only animal control officer in a poor rural county, his disappearance would be easy to overlook, easier than if it had been a cop. And he never went back. Whatever it was had let him go, and he wasn't about to risk becoming bait for anyone else. He left the job not long after, and the only comparison he could come up with was that the creature might have been related to a wendigo, though it didn't perfectly fit the stories he'd heard. Still, it was close enough, and all he knew for sure was that it was smart, it was dangerous, and it was still out there. This story comes from a user named Bradley Innovates, describing an encounter in the backcountry near the Alabama state line in 2019. The events took place not long after he'd returned home following his discharge from the US Marines. One of the first people he visited was his longtime friend Jacob, someone he'd known for over a decade. During their time catching up, Jacob mentioned a secluded hangout spot that he and his ex-girlfriend used to escape to and suggested they head out there for a bit. With nothing else going on, Bradley grabbed his gun and went along. The area they visited was remote, thickly wooded, and quiet. The main feature was an old dock that had clearly been forgotten. Its boards were warped and rotting, barely able to support their weight as they messed around. About half an hour in, Jacob brought up the subject of the wendigo. Bradley had heard the name before, but never took it seriously. Jacob claimed that saying wendigo 3 times in the woods would summon it, that it would show itself to anyone foolish enough to try. Bradley, thinking it was a joke, dared him to prove it. Jacob passed the challenge back to him, and despite the hesitation, Bradley gave in. They walked deeper along a trail that cut through the dense pine forest, the kind of area where no one would ever stumble across you by accident. The rain from earlier days had soaked the ground, and everything underfoot was soft and waterlogged. After around 20 minutes, they decided they were deep enough. The wind whispered through the tops of the tall pines above, but everything else was quiet. Standing in silence, Bradley said it. Wendigo, then again, wendigo, and one last time, wendigo. Nothing happened. The forest simply stayed still. No sudden noises either. Both of them started laughing, throwing jabs back and forth, proud to have gotten under each other's skin for nothing. But the calm didn't last. A noise ended up breaking through the trees ahead, and Bradley, still wired from his time in the military, immediately reacted, scanning in the direction of the sound. At first, they saw a few coyotes break through the trees and bolt across the path about 30 feet away. That should have eased the tension, but something about it didn't sit right. Bradley felt it in his gut that it was time to go. As they turned around to leave, a groaning sound stopped them in their tracks. One of the pine trees, tall and heavy, began to shift and crack. Without thinking, Bradley shoved Jacob forward just before the tree came crashing down between them. The impact shook the ground while Jacob froze, being terrified, and Bradley jumped the fallen trunk, grabbing him by the shirt and yanking him upright. His friend was still panicked, and Bradley had to yell, trying to snap him out of it, screaming at him to move. Jacob stumbled, fell to his knees, and was pulled up again before both of them broke into a full sprint down the path. It was then that the voice came, clear and familiar. It was the voice of Jacob's younger sister Olivia, calling to him, begging him to come quickly. It came from behind them, and Jacob tried to turn around, shouting her name, but Bradley blocked him, grabbed him, and told him to focus. "It's not her," he yelled, shaking him. "You hear me? It's not her." That was when another tree started to give way. Bradley saw it in time and tackled Jacob, both of them barely missing the fallen trunk. He shouted again for Jacob to go, then pulled out his gun and aimed down the trail behind them. Jacob ran ahead and eventually reached the car, but when he turned, he saw Bradley was still standing there, weapon drawn. "Bradley, come on," he yelled. Bradley turned and ran. And then, just 50 feet from the clearing, both of them saw it. The creature stood upright on two legs, towering at nearly 9 feet. Its frame was skeletal, with skin stretched tightly over bone. Its arms and legs were thin, unnaturally so, and its skin was a pale, bloodless white. The most striking feature was its eyes, bright, unnatural blue, glowing like something mechanical or artificial. Bradley didn't waste any time. He raised his gun and fired, with the sound echoing through the trees. He didn't stay to see if it went down, but Jacob was already running, and Bradley followed. They made it back to the car and drove away, neither of them looking back. That was the first time Bradley ever saw something he could only describe as a wendigo. He's never gone looking for it again and hopes he never sees anything like it for the rest of his life. This account came from a woman who recounted a terrifying overnight drive she took with her sister a few months earlier. They were headed to Dillon, Colorado, rushing north on a family emergency. Most of the trip was uneventful until they passed Leadville, when a string of strange and disturbing events began to unfold across the winding mountain roads. It was around 9 p.m. and the sky had long since gone dark. The road was narrow, barely lit, with little around them besides their headlights and the shadows of the forest pressing in on both sides. The younger sister who narrated the story was in the passenger seat while her older sister drove. Despite the late hour and the long drive, they decided to push through rather than stop at a motel. Not long after they made that decision, something unexpected happened. Her sister suddenly slammed the brakes hard. She's not someone who panics easily, especially since she drives a cab for a living, so that kind of reaction set off alarms right away. Before the passenger could even ask what happened, her sister told her to look up. There, standing in the opposite lane, was a massive coyote. Not just large, it was abnormally big, and it wasn't just looking in their direction, it was looking directly at them. Not at the car, but at both of them, making strong, unwavering eye contact. The younger sister, immediately uncomfortable, told her to drive and not look back. They passed it without incident, and though they tried to brush it off with jokes, there was something about how intelligent the coyote's stare had been that made it impossible to ignore. They continued driving with the road still empty, and a few minutes later, her sister suddenly asked, "Did you see that?" She thought her sister was messing with her until she turned and saw how serious she looked. Her sister said she saw a hand come from the backseat and touch the dashboard right in front of her. She even demonstrated it, being that she raised her fist and tapped the dash. The passenger saw nothing, but the driver insisted. Still on edge, they decided to drive on. The road twisted through the mountains, and that's when the passenger saw something of her own. A woman, barefoot, standing on the roadside in a torn white dress, all alone. She was just there, unmoving. The passenger opened her mouth to ask if they should stop, but before she could say anything, the woman disappeared behind them as they took a bend, and when she looked back, there was no trace of her. Just empty road. No way someone could have vanished like that. Once they reached the edge of Leadville, they hoped things would calm down, but as they crossed through the town and back into the quiet darkness, it only got worse. A few miles past town, the sister grabbed her arm again. "Did you see that?" She hadn't. Her sister said she saw breath fogging up the outside of the windshield. Not the inside, not from them. It looked like someone or something was out there, right in front of the glass, exhaling. They pushed forward though regardless, and eventually they came across what looked like a parking lot or maybe an inn, oddly placed in the middle of nowhere. As they approached it, they saw headlights coming toward them from another car. But the car didn't stay on the road. They both watched as it drove parallel to the highway, then vanished. It didn't go over a hill or around a curve, but simply just blinked out. They joked about aliens trying to stay calm, but the atmosphere was shifting fast. Her sister started to act differently and she began complaining that the lane markers were disappearing. She said she couldn't see where the road ended or where the next lane began. On a dark 2-lane mountain road, that kind of confusion could have killed them. The passenger could still see the lines clearly, but her sister swore they were gone, like the whole road had turned into one endless strip of asphalt. And then came something worse. It felt like the car was being pushed downhill, not just the natural slope of the mountain, but as if something behind them was pressing the car forward. Her sister was riding the brakes, but it felt like they were gaining speed anyway. The slope wasn't steep enough to explain it, and the weather was calm. No rain, no wind, but the trees outside were swaying hard. When her sister asked if it was windy, the passenger checked the weather on her phone. But it was nothing, just dead calm. But the trees were bending like a storm was hitting them, and the air inside the car got heavy. There was a sense that something was in the woods watching them. The forest didn't feel like just trees anymore, it felt aware, like it was surrounding them on purpose. The passenger started praying, and she could feel something evil around them. A deep, quiet dread started rising in her chest, and it wouldn't let her go. Her sister reached for her hand as they drove slowly down the road. That's when the passenger opened herself to whatever was out there just for a second, and something came through. Her voice changed. It dropped 2 octaves lower, flat and guttural, and she said a single word, murder. That wasn't her voice. She started crying, terrified, and clutched her St. Mary medallion. She made her sister pray with her, but even that felt like a struggle, like something was trying to stop them from speaking the words. Whatever was following them, it didn't want them getting out. They finally made it to the hotel, shaken and exhausted. Sitting in the room, they tried to process what had happened, and that's when her sister admitted she'd seen something trailing them during the worst part of the drive. A skeletal figure with bits of rotted flesh still clinging to its limbs. Its head was shaped like a deer skull, and its eyes glowed red in the dark. It had followed them from the trees while they descended the mountain. Later, they casually asked their stepmom, who grew up in the Denver area and had relatives in Dillon, if she ever found that stretch of road strange. Without even saying which road, she immediately understood. As a kid, she remembered waking up terrified every time they passed through that same section at night. She even shared a memory of seeing a car come straight at them once, headlights blinding her, only for her dad to say there was nothing there. There were other strange things too, like how the fist-shaped hand that hit the dash may have been a sign for stop in American Sign Language. Looking back, they wondered if all the strange encounters, being the woman on the road, the breath on the glass, even the vanishing car, were warnings. Something trying to tell them not to keep going. Something trying to protect them from what waited further ahead. Whatever they drove through that night, it left a mark. They never went back, and they both agreed that whatever her sister saw was trying to drive them off the road. Whether it was a wendigo or something else, they didn't want to know. This story was posted by a user who described something that happened in the late fall of 2010, deep in the forest along the Ontario-Manitoba border. He had gone on a moose hunting trip with his father and older brother, setting out early before sunrise to cover as much distance as possible before dark. They traveled all day by canoe, stopping often to portage around rapids, and by evening they made camp partway to their destination. Once the fire was lit and the others had gone to sleep, he stepped away to grab firewood and relieve himself near the edge of the river, just out of sight from camp. While he stood there watching the brush 15 yards away, where a rustling sound had come from, a sudden wave of dizziness and lightheadedness passed over him, and at the same time, he caught the smell of something rotten, like curdled milk or food left to spoil. He kept staring into the trees as the shapes in the darkness slowly shifted, with the branches and trunks subtly bending and rearranging until they began to form what looked like the outline of a head, followed by faint facial features. As his eyes adjusted, he started to make out more detail, and then a voice came from that same spot. It sounded exactly like a close relative who had recently passed away. The shape in the trees started to look more and more like that person's face. The voice spoke again, saying, "Hello, I've missed you. Come see me." For a moment, he smiled and stepped forward, drawn in by the familiarity, and then he stopped, something about it giving him pause. The face stopped smiling, the skin growing pale, and parts of it began to peel off, dropping away from the cheeks in pieces. His sense of comfort quickly turned to fear. He realized he'd moved farther from the firelight than he meant to, and that the voice had led him out into the dark. It spoke again, this time louder and angrier, yelling for him to come closer. He turned and ran, and when he looked back, the thing was no longer hiding behind a human face. It was tall and thin, with rotting flesh on exposed bone, sunken eyes, and a chest that looked empty. As he ran along the riverbank, trying to scream for help, his voice came out hoarse and strained, but he could hear it chasing behind him, with its footsteps heavy and fast, and its breathing close. Just as he reached the top of the riverbank, the creature grabbed his leg and pulled him down. He clawed at the ground, trying to lift himself up, and managed to yell that something had his leg. That woke his brother, who rushed over, pulled him to safety, and helped him back to the fire. Shaking, he tried to explain what had happened, telling them the thing looked like their relative, but changed into something else. His brother didn't question it, but simply said, "I saw it too, I know." That was all he needed to hear. They stayed up the rest of the night with rifles in reach, and when daylight came, they packed up and went home. The experience followed him long after they left, and he had nightmares and saw dark shapes near his window at night. Even during the day, he sometimes saw that same figure. He visited medicine men and shamans who performed ceremonies that helped, but only for a short while. Friends gave him protection pouches and crystals, but nothing fully stopped it. He later read that if a wendigo touches you, it can attach itself like a parasite, and that seemed to explain why he couldn't shake the presence. He grew up on a remote Ojibwe Chippewa reservation surrounded by untouched forest, and when he asked his father years later if he had noticed anything strange that night, his father said the air had smelled and tasted stale. Since that night, the forest has never felt the same. Even though he grew up loving the outdoors, he no longer feels safe in the woods. He always keeps his back against something solid when he's out there, watching carefully, still carrying the weight of that night. During 2 summers spent guiding canoe trips through the Lake of Woods region, which stretches across parts of Minnesota and Manitoba, one guide recalled a quiet but disturbing experience tied to a place that Ojibwe people have long referred to as Wendigo country. The name isn't just cultural, but actually shows up on maps too, with sites like the Wendigo Islands marking the land. While the area is known for its natural beauty, the guide and others in the program had learned that certain sites were considered off limits, both out of respect for Ojibwe land and because of stories passed down over generations. He had heard plenty of strange experiences from other trip leaders, but one night during a youth canoe trip stood out from the rest. The group had paddled all day and eventually stopped at a campsite known as Little Trisket. There were 2 guides and about 7 kids in total. One of the campers, a boy with limited communication abilities who likely sat somewhere on the autism spectrum, seemed off edge shortly after they arrived. While the group prepared dinner over a fire, the boy kept pointing toward the woods and asking who the man back there was. He described him as tall, very thin, and completely white. The others looked where he pointed but saw nothing, and a head count confirmed no one was missing. They brushed it off and returned to cooking, assuming it was imagination or, confusion. Later that same evening, after lights out, something else happened. One of the campers, a girl who had her own tent since she was the only female on the trip, suddenly called out, telling the guide to stop. From their own tent, the 2 leaders responded, letting her know they were still inside. She didn't push it further, and eventually the camp went quiet. In the morning, they asked her about what had happened, and she said that someone or something had been shaking her tent. She assumed one of the guides was playing a prank until they confirmed that they hadn't left their shelter. It hadn't been a windy night either, and none of the boys had been out of their tents. But the oddest part came when they started packing up. As they removed her tent stakes, they found that 2 of them were bent at sharp right angles. These weren't soft aluminum pegs either, but they tested the remaining ones and found them too rigid to bend easily. The guide mentioned he'd camped in storms with winds as high as 40 miles per hour, and even then, the stakes had never been bent like that. Once they left Little Trisket, the strange activity stopped. The remainder of the trip was uneventful and by all accounts enjoyable, but the experience came full circle once they returned to base camp. Another guide who had visited the same site the night after mentioned something strange before hearing any details about their own night. She told them she'd gone off into the woods to use the bathroom and thought another camper had followed her. She said she saw something large, pale, and humanoid nearby that fled before she could speak, but when she returned to camp, all of the kids were still around the fire and no one had moved.